Welcome to Inside Voices, a well-read magazine between the pages podcast. I'm Robert Gwaltney, joined by my host and dear friend Jeffrey Dale Lofton, and we're both really excited today to enter into conversation with Piper Huguley. Welcome, Piper.
Thank you. Welcome to you guys. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're excited to chat with you this evening. And before we
Mhm.
get started, Piper, I'm going to share a little bit about you with our listeners.
Great.
So Piper's biographical historical fiction, By Her Own Design, a novel of Ann Lowe, fashion designer to the Social Register through Morrow Publishing, tells the inspiring story of the Black fashion designer of Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress. By Her Own Design was a Booklist Top 100 Editor's Choice selection for 2022 and was named one of the top 100 books of 2022 in Canada by the Globe and Mail newspaper. She's also the author of Sweet Tea by Hallmark Publishing and author of two historical romance series, Migrations of the Heart, about the Great Migration, and Home to Milford College. Her next historical fiction book, which is out now, American Daughters, is the story of the decades long interracial friendship between Alice Roosevelt and Portia Washington, the rebel teenage daughters of President Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington, respectively. She's a literature professor at Clark Atlanta University and blogs about the history behind her novels at piperhughley.com. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with her husband and son. Jeffrey.
Piper, it's so good to be with you here today.
Yes.
It was great fun meeting you in San Diego, and now we get a chance to really sit down and talk.
Yes. 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 That is true. That is true.
And Piper, I loved your book about Ann Lowe, and I wanted to start by talking about that. What really struck me is that you began the book
Mhm.
and Ann Lowe's story near the end of her life.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you pretty quickly show that you know that she struggled in a
Mhm.
variety of ways. I mean, her human frailties certainly, regret, jealousy, even anger, uh,
Mhm.
as much a source of her pain as her physical ailments at that point in her life.
Mhm.
Why did you begin her story by showing her at this point late in life?
Well, I'm the nerd enough to know and to have figured out or known instantly when I started researching Ann Lowe as a subject. That when I saw her death date, I knew instantly it was the day after Charles and Diana had gotten engaged. So I'm older than both of you, but I remember as a young nerdy child, for the later half of the 70s at least, everybody wondering when Charles was going to get married, what that wedding was going to look like. Now, one of the things I had learned was that Ann Lowe, as a fashion designer, was someone who regularly chased commissions. And so when I saw that, the thought instantly came to my mind of this is a commission that she's not going to get. She knows that she's dying, or maybe this is what happened. She knew that she would be dying. She was blind at that point. And so knowing that she this is the commission that everybody had waited so long for, it wouldn't be hers, and she wouldn't get to see it as well, would be the thing uppermost in, or this is how I imagined it, at least uppermost in her dying mind. And that would then potentially give someone who was in that position an opportunity to reflect back upon the regrets, the hits and misses of their lives. So I wasn't thinking of her struggling necessarily or in pain, but more regretful that she would not be able to chase and or obtain that last commission, knowing that someone else would get it and it would change their lives.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. In the story, her story that you tell is about her career,
Mhm.
certainly immensely that immense talent, that
Mhm.
shone so brightly. But it's really the story of her life, her relationships, her mother, sister, husband, and
Mhm.
all of that.
Mhm.
The fashion is, I wouldn't say secondary, but you really do dig into who she is.
Mhm.
How did you do it?
Well, it's interesting because for most historical fiction people, when you're looking for sources to try to get close to your subject, to begin to tap into who they were, whatever, for marginalized figures, you don't have as many of the traditional sources, primary and secondary, that you would have for someone like that. So there were certain serendipitous things in terms of who Ann Lowe was, in terms of her origins, her early years, that I had already come to the table knowing, being a part of, and reflecting things that if I had been another author who didn't know those things, it would take time to get up to speed on them. One of them being that my paternal great grandmother was born 2 counties over from Ann Lowe up at about the same time as Ann Lowe. So I knew from family history what her young years could have possibly looked like from family lore. And then as a scholar, I had done a great deal of research for my dissertation about Zora Neale Hurston, who coincidentally was born another 2 counties over from Ann Lowe. And a lot of people, when they think of Zora Neale Hurston, they think Florida, but she was born in Alabama. Then the family moved to Florida. So these were certain things that had been part of my background and my scholarship and research that kind of put me ahead of the curve in terms of tapping into what her mindset from the beginning would be. And as someone who, for these 2 books anyway, writes a biographical historical fiction, that whole viewpoint of childhood plays a very important role for me in terms of the way the character is shaped later on. And I do take a certain amount of time with that, whether it plays a large role in the book, lesser so in American Daughters, because I start things when they're a little older, or to a deeper extent in By Her Own Design. So,
So, so Piper, you just referenced that for there were limited resources, research resources, and you were fortunate for her already to sort of be within your frame of reference. I recall you and I first met. We were both panelists on a Broadleaf Writers Conference a couple of years back, and I remember on that panel you talking about you endeavoring to amplify unheard voices in your writing, and so you touched on that with Ann Lowe, but talk overall about your work in ensuring that underrepresented and unheard voices have representation.
Well, this is the thing. Our historical, what it's become knowledgeable to, I think, a broader sense of the population over the past 15-ish years now, is that our historical narrative that we're taught in school is a very limited, fixed one that focuses on a certain portrayal of United States history that has purposefully, I would say, omitted the narratives of marginalized people from it, to the point where it's almost more of a mythology than what people think of as a factual historical narrative. A lot of it because purposefully a lot of stories and contributions have been omitted from the narrative. It means it's incomplete. And what I noticed prior to my publishing these books, was the efforts of other historical fiction writers bringing in these omitted narratives to widen or to broaden the picture of what history is and who it includes. I lurk a lot in historical fiction groups. And, one of the things that gets said an awful lot by people is like, when I was in school, I hated history. I didn't like it. Right? And part of the reason people have they hear that, even still people who don't know what it is, they hear what history and like, oh no, I don't want to hear that or whatever, because they're thinking back to what they had been forced to learn in school instead of this broader, more inclusive, bringing it back and allowing these other voices, and not other in terms of otherized, but voices that are not currently part of the historical record back into the conversation. Not necessarily by any means necessary, because historical fiction is fiction, but by taking factual information and creating a narrative from it, that for me begins to plant seeds in the minds of people's understanding of what history could possibly be and what it actually is. I call it a phenomenon that puts butts in seats in potential history classrooms to get people engaged, whereas having been part of that mythological narrative that was so rigid that they had to learn in school, to begin to be more included. And part of that movement is because over the past 50 years now, you have had multiple scholars from varying backgrounds become part of history department and scholarship and everything like that. So it's now, in the past 15 years, has kind of more or less filtered to the population, which has meant danger in the minds of those who are insistent on protecting that mythological narrative. So when Time magazine puts on their covers that were in the history wars about 8 years ago, I would say, yeah, it's about 10 years ago. I knew that already.
Have you personally experienced any pushback in regards to this particular novel we're discussing, that we've been discussing, Ann Lowe's story?
Not in Ann Lowe's story necessarily, but prior to that, in my historical romance series, the pushback began. Like I said, when I started indie publishing those on my own, people who say just for the for the Humpty Milford College series, someone who said in a post, there was no such thing as a Black college graduate in 1866. But that's not true. And those, people have it in their minds that nobody could have possibly gone to college in the 1860s. That's not true. It was Oberlin College, right? And Oberlin College had produced its first female college graduate in 1862. Right? So this is sort of this aspect in terms I knew that, which is one of the reasons why I said the story in 1866, because that was factually possible, right? In terms of that. But the narrative that we're taught is that Black people couldn't have possibly gone to college back then. There wasn't scads of them, but it's not true in terms of that. So just something like that. Yeah, pushback happens, definitely.
It's true that the textbook accounts are lacking. Yeah. Sometimes, a major event is relegated to a paragraph. Sometimes it's not even included.
Right.
And as you said, there are so few primary and secondary sources to pull from. Why do you write? I'm just curious. Why did you decide to write historical fiction rather than the nonfiction?
Well, as a scholar, one of the other things that I also know, that for biographies, for instance, biographies are works that take upwards of 3 to 5 years, minimally, of dedicated time, money, and resources to generate. The co-winners of this year's Pulitzer Prize, one of them that I called for, but I didn't think it was going to be a tie. So it's most interesting that it was a tie, of King, by Jonathan, I think Eeg is how you say his name, and Ilion Wu, who wrote Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, about the crafts. Both of them spent much longer than 5 years writing those books. And that's all they did in those years. Repeatedly applying for funding, grants, all of these other opportunities to be able to generate these two magnificent, amazing biographies. And that's the typical, if you're going to do it right in terms of biography, that's the typical time frame. So that kind of work is beyond the capability of a relatively poorly paid HBCU professor who is teaching world literature to disinterested 20-year-olds and writing at night. It's not happening in a short amount of time to get a biography going about Ann Lowe. I also have an MFA. So my expertise, if you will, my area of knowledge is in creating and writing fiction. And as I say, my intention via By Her Own Design and my stories is to plant seeds for that endeavor to happen with someone else. Ann Lowe certainly deserves that comprehensive scholarly biographical project. The person who was doing it, whom By Her Own Design is dedicated to, unfortunately died of breast cancer in her mid-40s. Her family, as devastated as they were by her death at a very young age, does have her notes, does have the things that she was working on. And it is my hope that by disseminating word about this amazing person in a way that's accessible, that people can connect to and relate to and understands, will put someone's butt in a seat in order to write that particular nonfiction project. That is my hope for what By Her Own Design can do in terms of creating a conversation.
So Piper, you came to the table already with some information about Ann Lowe. She was familiar to you. And of course, I'm sure that you learned things about Ann that surprised you. But I have this sort of theory that fiction writers aren't quite, they're one person at the beginning of a book and another person at the end. What would you say that you learned about yourself, Piper, when you were writing that project?
Well, one of the things in terms of structuring the project, for me, in terms of what I was doing with it, was being very purposeful of putting forward Ann's life as an artist, and trying to ensure that as part of what she was doing, that a woman who, like her, born in Jim Crow, Alabama, this is the kind of creativity and artistry that she would have had access to. So by the time I finished writing and whatever, I found and thought that was very parallel to my situation. This is the kind of creativity and artistry that I have access to at this particular juncture and point, as I said, in my life in terms of what I do and who I am. So I did find and relate to her and her journey in that way. And one of the ways in which her journey is inspirational to me, that even when I may feel like giving up, like sort of knowing and looking at her, is inspirational in terms of just what she did to keep on going despite many obstacles that she encountered.
You mentioned, Jeffrey, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Piper, that you so effectively show how resilient she is. I mean, even as a young woman, I remember the red and black dress that she loves and continues to wear, and she continues to add panels and ruffles and flounces to make it fit her as she grows. And so, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the role of, I guess I'll transition to the garments, which they are really important in the book. Can you talk a little bit about the role of garments in how she finds her voice, how you show who she is through that part of her world?
Yeah, they are her canvas, right? In terms of the ways in which, the traditional ways in which people think of artistry or whatever. She saw her creations very much as an expression of her artistry and what she could do for it, but also what she felt she could do for that particular woman in order to try to bring out the best in her. So for me, the way in terms of thinking about fashion design and fashion overall, not as some kind of fluffy, unimportant surface level kind of circumstance or situation, but to try to bring across all of those things, the broad expanse of things that a fashion designer, creator, artist is bringing to the table when they are thinking about the kind of thing she did, designing bespoke, custom garments for one particular person.
So, Piper, go ahead, Jeffrey. Well, I don't want time to get away from us without us talking about your latest book, American Daughters, which was released on April 2nd, 2024. In the bio, I shared that, it's about the relationship between Portia Washington and Alice Roosevelt. Talk a little bit about that book and why you felt compelled to tell that story.
Well, some of the times what we see going around are these polls that ask people, do they have a friend of a different race? And it's not surprising necessarily to me to see how high the percentages are of people who say no, they don't have a close friend of another race. But it is something in terms of thinking about the way it is, or the way race is happening now in the United States, in terms of why that is or isn't more in terms of that. So when, as someone who had been sort of looking into both protagonists from the presidential history side as well as the Washington family side, when in my reading I came across the fact that they had been friends for decades, as it turns out, I was instantly struck. Why do we not know about this particular story? And of course, once again, the confirming kind of research that would confirm a certain thing about their friendship doesn't exist, because in 1901, seemingly this whole notion of having a friend of a different race is not a construct that exists. So that's, again, the kind of place where I thought, oh, here's a sort of a silent place, a silent space, a lacuna in history that could be potentially bridged in by historical fiction and my reflections of where and how these two women who are of different races but have a lot of similarities in common, how they might have come together, come apart over from 1901 when they first meet, but we know that factually, to 1978 when Portia dies, and their friendship is mentioned in her obituary in the Washington Post. So, and it just so happened that the release of American Daughters came at the tail end of a little trend of interracial fiction, interracial friendship, historical fiction, with two other books, The First Ladies and Can't We Be Friends? But mine is different in that it's the earliest example, and that I wrote it by myself, and it wasn't co-authored.
So Shepard, you and I are just talking over each other this evening because we're so excited.
I'm curious. But I was wondering if you talk a little bit about how you give power to these women when there are these these very many levels in society. There's race, there's gender, there's class, there's all of these kinds of things. You find a way to give them power within their worlds. I was interested to know how you do that, why you do that.
Well, it's interesting because one of my little subtitles as I was thinking about the book was thinking about is the white princess of America and the black princess of America were friends. There's always been this parallel black media that runs, like I say, parallel to the overarching media resources that we know about or whatever. And during some previous interviews with American Daughter, someone referred to Portia Washington as obscure. Not to Black America, she wasn't. her father being the most prominent Black man in America at the time, everyone was certainly interested in knowing about and following what his daughter did. So their lives as daughters of very prominent men was something that you could argue gave them a certain amount of power, but also put a certain amount of pressure on them in terms of how they would either conform to a particular expected standard of being a model in some ways or not, as in the case of Alice Roosevelt, which, you know, intrigues everybody, right, in terms of Alice and what a rebel she was. And, you know, this is one way that she kind of shows her power in terms of not obeying her father, who says, "You will not smoke under this roof." So she goes up on the roof and smokes instead, you know, and later on in her life having that little embroidered pillow that, "If you don't have something nice to say about someone, come and sit by me." You know, everybody just loves Alice showing out, you know, and being all this other kind of stuff. But what intrigued me, and there are other historical fictions about her, what intrigued me about her was why. And it seems like nobody wanted to or had taken the time to think about, once again, that childhood space in terms of who she was, who she grew up to be, and why she would, you know, reach for the kind of thing she herself talked about, being a celebrity type figure prior to the existence of Hollywood, where the American public would glom on to her, and an attractive, young, beautiful woman who wore this particular color, and her color, Alice Blue, becomes a fad and a phenomenon, and they write songs about her. And for a woman at that time, even one as privileged as Alice is, the overarching question for a young woman is, who is she going to marry? Who is she going to marry that is going to, and this is whenever I tell my students this, it always rocks them. This is what it is. You're supposed to find this man to marry and then give him all of your talent and all of your, you know, good stuff and thoughts and whatever to support him and whatever it is that he wants to do. And this is like the husband, you know, search for her, plus someone who would be up to the standards of her father as well. Well, Alice was a very intelligent, very canny woman, who, had she been born much later, would have been some kind of politico. She would have been running campaigns. This is the kind of thing that she wanted to do. But instead, her knowledge base, the things that she knew and could do and understand, get used in a more twisted kind of way that doesn't. So, you know, in terms of, not saying giving them their power, but necessarily showing that the ways in which, when a woman's gifts, her passions, are not used in a productive way, they could be used in a negative way. In terms of that, which when I was speaking in Carlsbad, California, I kind of pointed out, in a way, Portia was more privileged than Alice in that way, because as a young Black woman, and even though she was famous in Black America, she still could have a passion about music and follow it to some extent, even as the question of who is she going to marry, Booker T. Washington's daughter, also loomed over her. But she at least had some time to have that. Alice didn't, which kind of always makes me sad about her.
Yes, people seeing themselves in fiction and popular culture is so important, especially for marginalized voices. I recently was giving some book recommendations, and I recommended Jeffrey's book, Red Clay Susie. I certainly, if I'd had access to that book as a young, lonesome, peculiar boy growing up in Southwest Georgia, it would have been a great comfort to me.
Yes.
Piper, if you had access to the lovely books that you write as a young girl, how would that have changed your outlook in any way? How meaningful would that have been to you?
Well, I think it would have been meaningful maybe in terms of thinking a little earlier, having it occur to me a little earlier that this might be something I could do. It took a long time for me to figure out that this might be something I could do. Fortunately, though, I was born to parents who imparted to me at a very young age the whole aspects about my historical place in the United States and sort of the very thing that I was talking about. I had been brought up with that in my upbringing, etc. So there were all kinds of ways in which both my mother and father, my father is a Black classical musician who a straight line could be drawn between what Portia Washington did that enabled my father to do the same thing as a classically trained opera singer, choir director, etc. Could do. So I had that. But this is the thing that I hope that books like mine, and certainly now books like both of yours, can do for circumstances that where children don't have that, where you have to kind of almost bring those role models to the table for yourselves in terms of, and that's the hope, I think, in terms of what it is that we do.
Well, Piper Huguley, you're doing the good work, and I cannot believe that we're getting close to the end of our time together. But before we part ways, what's next for Piper? What are you working on currently, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, that's the question, you know. It's like market forces in publishing once again are turning, you know. I've been working on a project for a little more than a year now, about Elizabeth Keckley, who was Mary Lincoln's dressmaker. But she was so much more than that. She stood astride the 19th century in a way. She was an enslaved woman, which would be a first for me in terms of writing about her. But she also was friends with Dred Scott. She was in St. Louis at that whole point in time when the decision, his suit and everything was happening. Yes, she made dresses ultimately for Mary Lincoln, but she also created dresses and apparel for Marina Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife, and many other wives of members of the Senate at that particular point in time. She wrote a book about the Lincolns. It's the first White House tell-all. It's the way in which we know the most about the Lincolns and their personal life was her book. And at the end of her life, she ends up teaching at HBCU, where she's a colleague of W.B. Du Bois. She's this amazing figure for whom there was a previous historical fiction that I just think I can do it better. So
And I think you can. I know you can.
So that is what I've been working on.
Well, Piper, thank you so much for joining Jeffrey and me this evening. And it's been a pleasure, and we wish you every success.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a joy to talk to both of you.
Thank you. So, gentle listeners, until next time for Inside Voices, I'm Robert Gwaltney.
And I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And remember, to be creative is to be courageous. Thanks for joining.